Hello, everyone. Here's Johannes Weikenmeier, and welcome to this week's Journal Club, where Mariana Kersh will be presenting on bone. She has just become, or this year was announced that she's associate professor, so congratulations to that. That's awesome. Her journey to where she is started, I think, with the bachelor's in English, which I saw, and then a transition to engineering, which is probably an interesting story in and of itself too. Went for her PhD to the University of Wisconsin-Madison and is now at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. She will be presenting work on bone, as I said, and has studied this in probably a lot of different fascinating creatures. So I'm really curious how many of those we'll see. And I'm hoping for a couple of nice videos. So with that, Mariana, please take it away.
Okay, thank you so much for the invitation. I'm so excited to be able to present, even barefoot today. So we're all comfortable. Let's see. Okay, so our group is interested in understanding the mechanical properties of musculoskeletal tissues. And we recognize that there is a variety of contexts in which we can look at this, including the ones that you see here on the screen. Primarily, our group breaks this down into a couple of key components in terms of tissue quality. So mechanical properties has a lot of different components to it. And when we think about tissue quality, it might be in the elastic region, plastic region, and so on, depending upon the loads that the tissue is expected to endure. And then we also know that that quality is, of course, then going to be a function of the structure. So how is it organized and its composition? What is it made of? Our group is interested in understanding essentially how this changes during growth and also during later life and maturation, where things like disease or injury states can impact us. But as we all know, as we're growing, we can also be injured. And so there's some relevance there in looking at how tissues grow, adapt, in particular in response to different loads that it's not expecting to see. We use a combination of techniques. So we have computational models. Some of those are fed by in vivo experiments, and you'll see some examples of that today. And then we have in vitro validation or testing. And I want to emphasize that all of these gears are turning together, and there should actually be some connected arrows between them, because we hope that we can generate interesting hypotheses using a variety of these techniques, and then keep kind of having this little machine turning to increase our understanding, essentially, of tissue quality. Today, we're going to focus on our efforts towards re-engineering bone, and hopefully there will be time in the discussion to also talk about where this interfaces with soft tissues as well. Oops. Okay, so why are we interested in looking at bone? So there's an old story, and it happened to be the case that a structural engineer named Carl Coleman was at a talk at the same time that an anatomist named Georg. I've kind of lost you all, so I'm going to move this back over here. Okay, there, perfect. Georg von Meyer, an anatomist, were in the same room. And Carl Coleman was drawing the principal stress directions on different cranes and different sort of traditional civil engineering structures. And Wolf was also in the room and essentially challenged him to create what was like a proximal femur. So this is the bone in your leg that's towards the top near your hip. And then drew the principal stress directions within the proximal femur using just a single boundary condition of your hip joint reaction force. And if you look at the cross-section of a real proximal femur, we can see clear correspondence between the principal stress directions and then the resulting trabecular structure. And so this together motivates the idea of the mechanostat theory of bone adaptation, and that's that a mechanical stimulus is going to essentially create the form of bone. Again, thinking back to that very first slide, there are many other pieces of this puzzle, but this is one that we can start to look at. When we look at what happens when the stimulus is decreased, so now we're kind of going below a sort of homeostatic threshold, so that's by that dashed line there in the slide. We know that if you take away forces from bone, that we see decreases in the curvature and overall decreases in mass, and this mirrors what you see in people with spinal cord injuries. If you just statically load bone, you still lose bone. right? So the static component, just holding bone in tension or compression, also results in bone mass, and this is somewhat similar to the losses that are seen in people like astronauts who in some ways are not even statically loading their bone too much at all. On the other side, though, what we're kind of interested in is what happens if we start increasing our stimulus beyond our sort of normal threshold. And there's some really compelling evidence from some of the elite athlete literature to suggest that bone really will adapt and that it's possible to do it, within a physiological regime. So a while ago, I worked on this study with Stu Warden, and this is looking at baseball pitchers and how their bones adapt. Can you see my mouse? Okay, great. So on the left-hand side here, we have the base. This is the same person. On the left side is the non-throwing arm. On the right side is the throwing arm. And now we've taken CT scan data and we can look at different cross sections along the humerus, and you can see the clear adaptation in the throwing arm compared to the non-throwing arm. And then we did sort of what would seem like an obvious result. We actually simulated the process of baseball pitching. So we calculated them or predicted the muscle forces using a computational model. I'll go into the details a little bit of that later. And then we have, again, the CT scans where we can create a finite element model, so a deformable model. And we see what happens if suddenly this pitcher started throwing with their non-throwing arm. So the case with baseball pitchers that's interesting is that they're typically unilaterally pitching, right? So there are very few pitchers who pitch with both sides. And so they serve as a really nice internal control system for understanding the influence of those mechanical forces on their bone. And what you can see here on the non-throwing arm on the left in the finite element model is that the strains are, of course, extremely elevated. And in fact, they are, from a prediction point of view, above a strain threshold. So if they suddenly started pitching with those same muscle forces, they would break that humerus. But of course, over time, this has adapted. What's tricky about this is that we don't know when that adaptation happened. And that's because baseball pitchers, of course, this is a cross-sectional study just following baseball pitchers that are at the elite level, but they've likely been pitching since they were small, right? Especially professional baseball pitchers. So when the adaptation happens is a little bit unclear. I want to overemphasize the fact that this is muscle-generated forces. So there's kind of a common dogma within the exercise literature in terms of adaptation that you need impact. People say you need to really impact your bones. And I want to remind you that these baseball pitchers, this is force generated by the muscles alone. The catcher gets the impact of the baseball, right? But this is all internally generated forces and torques from the muscles. And so that's what makes this pretty remarkable and gives us some confidence that, exercise, can really have an influence on how bone adapts. So some might, what a lot of people are working on is what's the mechanism behind this, and how does this happen, and how can we tease apart the contribution of muscle forces or mechanical loading to bone adaptation in general. It's very difficult to do this in humans, especially longitudinally or even cross-sectionally. And so a lot of people have turned to animal models. And so there's a long history, right, of using animal models in so-called loading at mechanical actuated systems. So typically what's done is the animal in vivo is one side is placed in a mechanical actuator while the other side is left alone. So kind of like modeling the pitching versus the non-pitching scenario. And then they're cyclically loaded. So as I said before, static loading isn't going to do much for bone. We know that. Of course, zero load will do nothing, but it really needs to be dynamic loading. And so again, there's a long history of papers that have shown that when you dynamically load bone, we get increases. So here on the x-axis are different measures of bone quality, so bone mineral content, bone mineral density, moment of inertia, depending upon how much bone is added. And this is percent difference on the y-axis of the loaded versus the non-loaded bone. And then here's kind of a cartoon depiction of if you have your initial baseline level, the gray, light gray, the black represents how much extra bone was added, right? So we know fatigue loading is helpful for bone. And so you can get some of that bone adaptation. And again, in the baseball pitchers, since they're playing so much, again, since probably they were young, they've essentially been fatigue loading it relative to normal everyday activity levels of loading. So this makes sense to us. However, one problem that exists right? Especially in those who are younger, is the possibility of what's called the dreaded black line within the clinical community. And this is an indication of a stress fracture. And so I know it might be a little bit hard to see here, but there's a dashed little black line showing up on this X-ray indicative of a stress fracture. And so it's possible, right, that while mechanical loading can be helpful, we know it can also be harmful for bone from a failure point of view. Two communities that are susceptible to this are military personnel and then the basketball players. And in both of those cases, these are, of course, younger people. In some cases, especially in the case of the military personnel, depending upon their experience, but you could have a young recruit who really hasn't done much exercise at all and then suddenly is running, a mile or two a day as they go into basic training. And so there's an increased incidence relative to the general population of stress fractures in both of these populations. So why is this happening? If we go back to the animal models, we know and we've learned now that rest is important. So here, what I'm showing are double labeled histo slides of bone adaptation. So you can administer fluorochrome labels, which are labels that attach to the calcium, and calcium is, one of the first depositing parts when bone starts to adapt. So essentially, when it starts to grow, a bed of calcium will deposit, and then the fluorochrome labels will bind to that. And so if you do two labels, you can kind of see what happens, and you space them apart, what that change in time of adaptation is. So here's what a cross section of, in this case, an ulna at 6 days of rest. And you can see this green label and is the initial label. And then all of that red is what formed over the course of time. And hopefully what you can appreciate is that it's kind of spongy, it's sort of disorganized, it has lots of porosity in it. But then if you wait 14 more days and see what happens and administer another label, you can see that now that bone is a bit more compact, slightly more dense. And so we know that there's, an evolution or a remodeling that's occurring within bone given enough rest. These bones have been tested in a variety of loading states. The most common is typically 3-point bending. And when we look at the actual structural properties of bone, so this is some really great work from Matt Silva's group, looking at the percent change in the properties. So ultimate force and stiffness here are shown relative to the controls. So on the x-axis is the days since the loading occurred. So a bout of loading is induced. And if you look at day 0, we see that the ultimate force and the ultimate stiffness significantly drop in the loaded arm relative to the non-loaded arm. You can see that by day 12, we've actually started to recover the properties, and by day 18, they're significantly increasing. So this adaptation that occurs is actually now making this bone structurally stronger. If we look, though, at the material properties, we kind of see a slightly different story. So the strength and the modulus from a material property point of view are actually staying decreased, right? So this is really a structural phenomena here. And we were particularly interested in this sort of small incremental improvement in bone properties and the structural properties at 6 days. So you can see relative to 0 days, we start actually gaining, right? So there is positive adaptation. We're not up to the controls yet, but we're starting to improve the strength of bone. Should I monitor the chat or wait? I'm good either way. So.
Sorry, I was the perpetrator. I was wondering what's the difference between stiffness and modulus?
Right, so stiffness is your structural property, force divided over displacement, right?
Oh, I see. Okay.
And then modulus is normalized. So one's a material property and one's a structural property. So the reason it's stiffer is essentially probably because there's more bone, but the material itself is the same, is what this data is showing. Excellent. So our question is, given that we know that we have fatigue loading of bone, so we know the populations that this is of interest in, and we know that if you give bone enough rest, there's even with a little bit of microdamage. So sorry, I didn't explain this quite clearly. That woven bone response is a response to microdamage that initiates within the bone. So when the bone, gets that disturbance, it initiates basically a damage-initiated response. And so if you give it rest, then you'll get healing via woven bone formation. And this has been checked in 3-point bending, but what we were interested in is what happens if we move to a higher strain rate or impact loading of bone, which we think is more, somewhat more relevant in terms of the loading conditions that military personnel and athletes might be seeing, given the way they're running on their bones. And it's probably a little bit more high strain rate, not quite as much bending. And so this is the work that Dr. Chenxi Yan took on in our group. So we took a group of rats and we used the left forelimb loading model, 22 of them. And we have basically the same setup, unloaded control side, fatigue loaded, so everything's paired. And we started at 16 weeks old. We had a 1-day rest group, so given 1-day rest, and then we went to 7 days of rest to see what would happen in terms of the differences in adaptation and mechanical properties and structural properties. So within each of these groups, we did micro CT analyses, and then we built a custom drop tower so that we can then start impact loading these bones. So you can see in the micro CT data, we did induce that woven bone formation. So this sort of more compact consolidated bone on the inside is the existing bone. Hopefully it's clear from this little video that you've got this really disorganized, new bone that's quickly formed, right? It's pretty remarkable that this forms just within a few days, right? As sort of like again, a repair response to the micro damage initiated by fatigue. And so here's the zoomed out version of our impact testing. So we have a load cell on the bottom. We have our bone samples embedded in PMMA on the top and bottom, or an epoxy. And then you have a an impact load coming down. And the loads that we used were normalized to body weight divided by, I think, 4 for the rats, right? Since we have quadrupeds and about 25% on one limb. Okay. So as I said, we have a load cell that can measure the force. We used a high-speed camera to measure the displacements. And then you can see here on the video on the left, that you might not see a lot of movement, and that's because this bone actually survived the test, whereas we did definitely fracture quite a few of these bones. And so if we start looking at force over time, we're able to look, combining the load cell and the camera data, we can then start getting our force displacement curves. So the results in terms of the mechanics, the mechanical properties or the structural properties here in this case, in both the 1-day rest and the 7-day rest, the loaded group always fractured at a lower force value than the contralateral control. And the delta here between the control and the loaded, so showing here on the left is the 1-day rest, here's 7 days of rest. And we basically see that we have the same drop in force. Right, so this 7 days of rest, even though you've got all this new woven bone, didn't really help in terms of impact loading. And the same is true with the stiffness. One might ask, why is the stiffness or the force a little bit higher in the 7-day rest group initially? And that's because 7 days of growth for these animals is a lot of time, right? So, they're just a little bit bigger 1 week later. But then again, if we compare the control group to the loaded group, we see that, again, same drop in stiffness. So we're kind of curious about what was going on from a material point of view in terms of this bone, since the previous work had suggested that the material properties were the same, right? The modulus had stayed the same over rest. And if we zoom into bone, we know that bone is made of mineralized collagen fibers. The actual organization of the collagen and mineral stages in bone is still a bit under debate. There's different models proposed in the literature, but we know that there's an organic component, which is mostly type 1 collagen. There's a mineral component, hydroxyapatite, and then some measures that are commonly reported in the literature is the degree of mineralization, because initially that mineral is immature, and then it will mature over time, and then crystallinity, which is an indicator of the impurities within the mineral component. What's known is that if you increase the mineral to matrix ratio, so how much mineral there is relative to the organic phase, that we get an increase in modulus and stiffness. This has primarily been shown using nanoindentation. So we did FTIR, which is a spectroscopy technique. This is work done with our collaborator, Rohit Bhargava, and looked at what was going on. So we took a couple of different cross sections within the samples. And what I'm showing you here on the left is the control group and loaded group with the 1-day rest. And we'll first look at the carbonate content in the bone, which is part of the mineral. And then these orange, sort of brownish group of data is the 7-day rest group. And so when we say control, we mean the unloaded limb. And now we looked at the difference in the actual chemical composition of the bone within the existing bone, this kind of nice compact bone, and then that disorganized woven cortical bone. And so we have our histological sections, and we can break it out into each of these different phases. So carbonate, phosphate are the mineral phases, and then the amide. So what we see is that in the woven bone, the carbonate content goes down relative to the unloaded control. And interestingly, this is true relative also to the existing cortical bone. There was no difference in the phosphate component. And there was also a really dramatic decrease in the amide component, so the collagen part of this. So what we have here is that in the woven bone, the carbonate and the amide phases are decreased. As I said before, what's often reported is that mineral to matrix ratio. And so here we have the phosphate to amide component. And we can see that because the amide has gone down, then that phosphate to amide ratio has gone up. And so this is in contrast to what's reported in the literature. But we know that in the literature, what's been shown is it's typically an increase because of the increase in phosphate, not because of a decrease in the amide. So, it's a kind of a simple lesson here that we learned. When you take a ratio, there's two ways that you can get the number to go up or down. You can increase the denominator, or you can, decrease the numerator, vice versa, right? And so it's really important to kind of go back to some of the raw data and look at what's really happening. And then the carbonate to phosphate substitution. So again, this is kind of an indicator of the substitution within the mineral, so of what's going on. We saw a trend, but no significant difference in terms of the load, in terms of the woven bone. Okay, so with this, what we've learned is that the change in stiffness in the bone is the same at 1 day and 7 days. So it basically is not helping us at all. And that we know that the organic phase in woven bone is lower. This is somewhat dependent on the resolution of the FTIR, which is pretty good, but there might be some other things that would contribute to this decrease in the amide or the collagen content. It might also be possible that the collagen also needs to mature, and so that's why we get this decrease in amide 1. But we're interested to hear anyone's thoughts on that. But Dr. Yan nicely summarized what he thought was happening. And if you imagine taking a pipe, and it's nice and stiff, right, which is what our existing cortical bone is, and now you fatigue loaded it, and now you've added this very soft surrounding to it. So like you've added foam to it. That foam from an impact point of view is not really helping at this point for impact loading, right? It did provide some benefit for 3-point bending. Again, not as much to the controls, but we definitely lose all of that benefit in under impact loading conditions. And so what it does is it really highlights the importance of rest. Okay, so yes for 3-point bending, no for impact. So one of the things that we're interested in is what are the fatigue loading conditions that might actually be driving some of this? So the actuated loading models are really useful, but they're just models, right? And so how do we know what kind of loads might actually, in real physiological cases, induce fatigue loading in bone? And so to start answering this question, we started looking at humans, and first looking at what's known about how bone is loaded. So people have, there are quite a few studies, you can see them down on the bottom of the slide, where people have actually strain gauged their own tibia. And usually it's the authors themselves. Yeah, I see some eyebrows going up. Can you imagine? That's like love of science right there. But it's very difficult otherwise, up until recently, to get even an idea of what the strains that bone actually sees during real physiological tasks. And so this has been done. What I've done is summarize the literature here in terms of the tensile compressive strains that have been measured. The lowest activity that's been documented is cycling. Walking comes next. Then you get a variety of kind of other activities. They're climbing a leg press machine. Sprinting is pretty high, and then jumping off of a box is the highest set of strains, right? So What we wanted to do was do this in basketball players because they are the population, again, of interest for us in terms of these stress fracture. Of course, we didn't want to strain gauge any basketball players, so we used a computational technique. So here we recruited college level basketball players, and we had them in a gait laboratory where we have motion capture and we have a force plate underneath. So we asked them to walk, sprint, jump off that box, sprint forward. Sorry, I forgot to turn off all the sound. Shuffling side to side. So these are all kind of common basketball maneuvers that are done while we're recording motion capture and ground reaction force data. And then we put this into a computational pipeline where we use musculoskeletal models, rigid body dynamics models to predict the muscle and joint forces. Combine that with CT images and create finite element models. And now we can get the dynamic time history of the loading of bone. What's nice is we have all that in vivo strain gauge data to compare our models to see how close we are. So in terms of the principal strains, what I'm plotting here are the principal tensile and compressive strains during each activity. So when the foot is on the ground is what we're looking at. And so this is the time history of the strain averaged over all of our subjects. And what we found is that walking, for example, or walking strains at that maximum level were very similar, pretty close in terms of the in vivo strain gauge data. However, the compressive strains for walking for us were quite a bit higher. You know, and at first we were a little bit scared about why that might be. And we'll come back to that here in just a second. The sprinting activity elicited the highest strains and, you know, in the order of magnitude of what's been reported in the literature for the tensile and also for the compressive strains. Our other activity, lateral cut, was also quite high, and then everyone else kind of fell in the middle. And so now we can start teasing apart, you know, the picture of which of these activities are generating the highest strain. But the next question is, where is that high maximum strain occurring? So from relative to walking, which is like our baseline level, if you remember the mechanostat model, that's sort of the expected level of strain that bone sees. These now are the ones that are significantly higher than walking. If we look a little bit closer, you know, what matters is actually where that maximum strain is occurring. And what's nice about the computational models is we can kind of look at the map of them. And so we spatially aligned all of the FE models to a common template so we can actually see what's going on. And what we see on the compressive side is that the maximum strain is kind of in this lower left corner of our little, that's the posterior lateral corner of our little avocado slices of tibia here. And in vivo strain gauge data is actually occurring on the anterior side, where you can kind of feel your shin bone in the front where there's not much soft tissue to get in the way. So the in vivo data is not reflective of actually where the maximum strain is occurring. And that's really important because, you know, this is going to impact how we interpret these results. So if we kind of line everyone up, we can see now that where the maximum strain during the different activities is actually dependent on the activity itself. So here, when we look at all of them, you can see, for example, that the shuffle elicits highest strains on that anterior side, as does sprint forward, backward, and lateral cut, whereas walking, jumping, and sprinting creates higher tensile strains on the other side of the bone. Compressive strains, however, all tended to line up within the same region. The other thing we want to know is how much of the bone is actually higher than walking, and this would be indicative of, it's been shown that the number of cycles to fatigue failure is a function, not just of the maximum strain magnitude, but how much of the bone is actually under a higher level of strain. So again, what we can do is kind of compare point by point within each set of models, how much of this is higher than this region over here, because we've discretized our model into finite regions. So in the case of sprinting, nearly all of the tensile strain in every location is higher. In the compressive case, 88% of the bone, and you can see what happens with the rest. So these lower strain activities, sprint forward, backward, shuffle, and jumping, only increase the load significantly in certain regions, as you can kind of imagine by the color maps here. So what have we learned? We've now learned that sprinting at least elicits the highest strain response. the tensile strain, where it is maximum, is a function of the activity, while the compressive strains are all primarily occurring maximally in the posterior region. So our last little piece of the puzzle that I'll kind of allude to here is, okay, so we've learned, impact loading can be bad, rest is important. We've now learned which activities might be kind of putting bone more at risk of fracture, right, based on these maps relative to walking. So now one other question, you can mitigate this with rest, but one of the questions that we're interested in understanding is, can we do anything about it ahead of time? This is particularly relevant for not only these military personnel and athletes, but also for later in life. If we want to mitigate osteoporotic fractures, then what we really want to do is know what exercise you could do when you're young, like those baseball pitchers, to kind of prime your bone to be ready for later life. I think the key to remember here is that your bone is not adapting to prepare you for a fall. It's adapting to prepare you to walk around, right? And so it's possible, though, to start teasing out how we could use a similar technique to understand how we could exercise ourselves or our bones early on to prevent some of those fractures. So we're doing this a little bit in humans, but one really exciting project is our horse project. So this is some really exciting work from Sarah Masaga and our group in collaboration with orthopedic surgeon Annette McCoy, Dr. McCoy, and then VetMed DVM student Sam Hammock. So apologies, Sam, that you're not on the slide, I'm sorry. In the case of horses, we know that they are susceptible to fractures and that these fractures are fatigue initiated. They tend to occur down here in the metacarpophalangeal joint. Interesting fun fact is that that's like a bone in your hands, right? They're not like the femur or the tibia. And so here's just a depiction of what some of those stress fractures look like. And what we're interested in doing first is understanding what we did first is looked at what do horses do when they're young, right? Like, why do they get these stress fractures once they start training? So the stress fractures, of course, occur once they start training, which happens somewhere 1 to 2 years after they're sold, or so 1 to 2 years of age. And so here's just a still shot of a bunch of the foals out on the horse farm at UIUC. And what we found just looking at GoPro data is that they spend most of their time like kids eating, right? Kind of standing around a little bit aloof, and then not very much time spending moving around at speed. So they're not doing a lot of running around. And in fact, if you look carefully, most of them are just kind of Netflixing on the ground, basically, right? So they're just chilling out. So what Sarah did was started tracking their development and trying to figure out whether or not something about the way they grow is making them more or less susceptible to stress fractures, because again, bone's just going to adapt to the loads that it sees. So we have 3 foals that we followed longitudinally over the course of a year, took CT data, took their mineral density values, split it up into these different quadrants. And so what we're plotting here is just a cross section of the bone within the middle of the bone in the diaphysis. And the lighter colors correspond to a lower mass, which essentially is age, right? So as they're growing, they're getting bigger. But of course, the rates between different horses might be slightly different. So we just normalize by mass. And what I'm showing here is these different quadrant analyses, in this case of mineralization levels. And so if we start, and then we split it up into cortical and trabecular bone. So this inner circle represents the mineralization levels in these 4 different quadrants of the cortical bone at the start of our study. And then what happens to the bone, and then here's the trabecular bone, which actually starts here in this light orange circle. And then this is what's cool, right? Is that as they grow, the cortical bone expands roughly evenly and the trabecular bone sort of decreases roughly evenly. So we have a conversion of trabecular to cortical bone. And then that's reflected in the accrual rates, or how much mineral is accruing in each of these compartments. Somewhat similar, but slightly less symmetric pattern within that proximal region where the stress fractures occur. And then this is reflected in the accrual rates. And then what was kind of exciting for us was looking at bone area fraction. So how much bone is actually there? So what I just showed you was the mineralized, how much mineral there was within the bone, but let's just look at how much bone there is. And so here again, within the diaphysis, the middle section where the fractures do not occur, or time point 1 is this light blue, time point end, like a year or so later, is this dark blue. And so we see that we kind of get equal expansion of bone in all 4 quadrants in the cortical bone. And then really something asymmetric happening in the trabecular bone. But this is not where the fractures occurred. The fractures occurred up at the top in the proximal region. And now we see this completely asymmetric pattern. So for whatever reason, right, this bone is growing such that we have way more cortical bone in 2 quadrants, but not in the others. And then, the trabecular bone grows in a similar manner. And so what this tells us is, hey, we need to start figuring out how to load this lateral palmar quadrant. One thing we've kind of come to realize with quadrupeds, at least, is that since their body mass is in the middle, imagine, you're on all fours, or just imagine a horse. The medial side of the bones are always going to be under more load than the lateral side because that's where the body mass is, right? So it's not that the lateral side isn't loaded, but it's definitely been shown to be loaded less. And so the bone's adapting for that, right? The medial side has more bone than the lateral side. But as soon as they start race training and start running around in circles or on these different tracks, they might be loading these other regions much more. And maybe this is our target, right, for exercise. So I'll conclude with our favorite last slide here. And so we've started exercising these horses. So here's the foal. The foal follows the mare. So here's example 1. And when they're really young, this is of course just walking. The foal just follows along beautifully. We've moved to going outside. We're starting now to do markerless motion capture. And what happens is as they start growing, you've got to keep racing them or running them faster and faster, right? So that, the relative speed is the right speed. And so here you can see just coming into frame is student number 1 running the mare, and then you'll quickly see the foal coming by. And so there we go, off they go, running. So we have 2 GoPros, that we're now registering together to get this data. And we're now at a point, I don't have any videos to show you, but we're running so fast that we actually have a 3rd horse, a pony horse, where the student rides the horse, which then, because we can't run as fast as the mare. So, these are like 5-minute miles or something. I mean, so when we exercise foals, everyone exercises, right? It's amazing. I mean, and they're out there every morning, 6:30, not doing mocap every day, but running these foals. And so we're really excited to see what's going to happen. So hopefully I've given you a picture of how we look at re-engineering bone using a variety of techniques, again, models, in vivo experiments, validating them and trying to improve our model predictions, because we really think this is the way that we can provide some really insightful information from a clinical point of view for human and equine athletes alike, as well as to others in the community. Of course, none of this was done by me. This was all done by this remarkable team of students. And I really want to thank our funding sources. And I'm really excited to answer your questions.
Phenomenal. Thank you so much. This was a great talk. I'm sure there's a series of questions. Is there anyone who wants to go first? I see a raised hand. Trisha, go ahead.
Hello, can anybody hear me, first of all?
Yes.
Yes.
Hi, so that was a really interesting presentation. I had a question, I think, on one of your slides. I believe it was slide 8. So I wanted to ask, like, in your opinion, how long do you think it would take for the bone to regain its ultimate force and stiffness back completely?
Right, so that's been shown in those previous studies. So I'll bring that slide up again to answer that. So here what you can see in the literature is, at least within rodent bone, what's been shown is that by day 12 after rest, so 12 days of rest, the fact that they're at 0 means they're back to controls. It's not significantly different than controls, but in the case of rodent bone, it took 12 days. And by 18 days, it's actually even higher than the control limb, right? The other limb that wasn't loaded. So if you give it enough time, the bone will mineralize. I think the challenge in non-rodent bone is that, so rodent bone is not osteonal. It doesn't have these like circular like human bone and large animal bone has bone that's organized like kind of like a tree structure. So it has these lamellar rings, right? And so there's a lot of porosity in human bone, and everywhere you have a surface on bone, that's a surface that's susceptible to remodeling, meaning osteoclast, the bone eating cell activity. And whether or not that holds true, well, we know in the case of rats, translates to the case of larger animal models, I'm not 100% sure.
Okay, thank you for that answer. Keshav, do you want to go next?
I had a question along the similar lines. When you say the bone's at rest, do you mean that the bone is withheld from any compressive loading, or is there still some compressive loading that's going on? I'm thinking in the case. Sorry.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So typically what happens is after the loading bout is done, the animals are allowed to recover, and then they're just back to cage locomotion, just like anything else. So it's not unloaded, right? It's just normal locomotion. So the bout of loading is not damage inducing enough at the whole body scale that, you know, they're a little bit sore. You usually give them a little bit of medicine so that they feel okay, but then they're up walking around within, you know, a couple hours.
Thank you.
Are there other questions from the audience right now? Yeah, I mean, in general, I really like this video where you show the woven bone that's growing around the core, and that must be a pretty dynamic sort of deposition and then resorption process. So do you like, how much does the diameter actually change following this one bout of fatigue? Meaning, does the bone actually change, or is this just like an inflammatory response that is trying to temporarily support, and then it will be completely resorbed?
I know that I believe in the timeframes that I've seen in the literature, it stays. So it consolidates, mineralizes. I don't know if I'm not saying the studies don't exist, but I have not with my own eyes looked at where they've maybe waited a year or 6 months to see if it eventually resorbs back to the control levels. You know, that's a good question. I'm not sure, but in the short term, it will stay that long, that big, and stay mineralized and continue to mineralize and form. You know, there might be some periosteal of the bone on the outside resorption that might happen as well. You know, it makes sense that it would eventually return back to normal.
That's really fascinating, because then in my mind that there could be a process that you continuously repeat after a certain time, and then it would always deposit that amount. That would really, I would find that an interesting. I'm
actually I have the slide here, so I'm not 100% right. So I don't have it here, sorry, but we actually, in the baseball pitchers, we did follow them after they stopped pitching. And I can answer that question to some degree then in the baseball pitchers. So we tracked baseball pitchers after they hadn't pitched in 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, and so on. And eventually the bone thickness went back to normal, but the outer diameter of the bone was still bigger. So the mineral content went back to normal, but once you get that shape on the outside, most of the resorption happened on the endosteal on the inside. So the pipe got bigger, but if you stop loading it, the wall thickness returned, but that's still a stronger bone, right? Think about bending a really thick pipe. That's the same wall thickness as bending a little thin one, right? With a thinner diameter, the moment of inertia goes up, right? As a function of the radius. So, so in humans, I know that's true. So, you know, yeah, you're right. It could be, and that's, I think the idea is, what do we need to do? What's the activity that we should be doing when we're young to prime bone to be ready? And what's the frequency and what's the optimal case, right, for human bone?
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much for that answer. Manuel, I think you had a question.
Yeah, I may be really revealing my complete naivete about bone here. But
go for it.
Interest for, you know, normalizing being
uneducated. Who is born knowing anything, right?
This is a safe space, Manu.
Right. So I guess I spent so much time thinking about soft tissues that I really hardly ever think about hard tissues. And so I was aware that bone is primarily collagen, but I guess I really have never thought about what qualifies collagen to be a hard tissue, right? In the sort of soft tissue community, we're always like, oh, you have this undulated collagen and it's really pliable at small deformation. That makes perfect sense. And then it sort of like stiffens and that makes perfect sense. And so to me, collagen in soft tissues makes perfect sense. So I'm just wondering, like, what makes collagen like a good substrate for being bone material?
My understanding is it's the scaffolding for bone. So when you're born with a cartilage template, which is basically mostly collagen based, right? So in utero, your formation of your bone starts as a soft collagen template, essentially, that gives you the shape. And then over time, it becomes mineralized, right? So it's fast. Maybe it's easy to form, right? You don't have to wait for the crystals to mature into fully mineralized bone. So that's why in quadrupeds, what they actually have is something that kind of looks like woven bone when they're young. So the example I'm showing here, it's important to distinguish. There's something called woven bone, which is that damaged inflammatory response. And then there's something called plexiform bone. Plexiform bone is this really disorganized, undermineralized bone. And that exists naturally in quadrupeds. And the reason for that, we think, is because they have to grow really fast. Like their growth rate and mass rates relative to humans is way faster, right? Like a horse matures and grows in two or 3 years, right? We take 18. And so in order to sustain those loads, a collagen template is put down much faster and then given time to mineralize.
And so when you say mineralized, so we basically have sort of ionic forces, right? So what qualifies a mineral? I guess sort of that there's ionic bonds, right?
So I don't know a lot about the actual molecular processes involved with mineralization. I know that we have the osteoblasts, which are the bone building cells. And I was actually just looking this up in fear of this question. So I would refer you to
You're welcome.
But I don't know the chemistry of how that happens, but the osteoblasts do secrete an initial mineral, and then there's some accrual, right, that's going to cause it to crystallize.
I really have to read up on bone, it turns out. Anyways, I really love this talk because at least for me, it like presented a nice break from thinking soft and provoking me to think of collagen as something else than just our extracellular matrix in the soft material. Loved your talk. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you. I think, Emma, do you have a question?
Yeah. So my question is kind of random and entirely on the macro scale. So I think you've kind of been alluding to this idea throughout your talk of maybe like an ideal exercise one could do when they're growing up or a kid or whatever. And I used to play ice hockey, and specifically I used to play like ice hockey goalie, which means that you wear like 40 to 50 pounds of equipment while you play. And that just got me thinking, are there any like sports or sort of like activities that you just think would be like absolutely fascinating to study? Like if you could do anything, what would you look at?
Oh, that is such a good question. And I'm pulling up a slide. So we just did a review paper where we looked at, so Sarah and Chinchi wrote this nice review paper looking at, here we go. Let me try and share this. It's actually in a different template, PowerPoint, but I think we'll get there. So we actually saw what was in the literature in terms of different sports that people did when they were young and how it affects their bone. So here we're looking at the femoral neck, which is the proximal part of the femur. This is our normal male population. This is our female population. So on the x-axis is age, and on the y-axis is bone mineral density value. And so what we did is try to see, there's a static component and then there's a dynamic component of any activity. And so what we did, so think of rock climbing, right? It's not like sprinting, right? You're like holding on really hard, right? So, but there's a high force, but you're not moving your muscles quite so much in the sense of where the maximum force is being generated. And then jump roping is the opposite, right? Like it's super fast, super dynamic, but you're not using maximum muscle force to jump rope. Does that make sense? So that's the kind of way you can think about these two things. And then here's everything in between. And now the question is, where does this show up on this plot relative to like normal kids who maybe don't exercise a whole lot or weren't actively involved in any of these activities? And so this is what it looks like. And I know it's kind of a hot mess here, but anywhere you see the actual icon, these are the ones that are significantly higher than their sex-based counterpart. So what that means is that male soccer players actually had higher bone mineral density than their non-soccer player age-matched counterpart. Female gymnastics, right? This is kind of interesting, right? But they're jumping a lot. Impact loading is important. I'm not saying it's not. Here's sprinters. Here's our jump ropers. And now here are the ones that are not so good, right? In this case. So we have swimmers down here. What is this? Aerobics, okay? And what's kind of interesting is tennis at the young age is showing up here, but it definitely will show up later if you continue to play tennis later on. So, you know, there have been a lot of studies that have been done looking at single arm sports because they're really exciting because you can control, like if tennis is a tricky one because you have the backhand, right? So you're using both arms. The baseball players are an interesting model. You know, that is such a good question. And, you know, you would think I would have thought, well, why don't we do this? So we've done, we published some work already where we've looked at long jumpers. We've actually looked at the legs of the baseball pitchers. So if you imagine the pitching task, they lift up one leg really high and then they stomp on it as they pitch that ball. So kind of picture the baseball task in your mind. So they're kind of loading this one leg, and we've actually found that their legs are different from the pitching, whatever that landing leg is, to the non-landing leg. So I think there's some interesting things that we could look at in terms of stuff you can do when you're young. Continuing to exercise in mid-age is also still important. So maybe, you know, like Dance Dance Revolution would be really cool to maybe look at and see what happens in terms of bone. Who knows?
Thanks for sharing your paper. I'll definitely have to check that out. I think Adrian now is like, what about cycling? And Mateus is like, should I go work out now?
Yeah, I mean, it's great for your muscles, right? And it's great for your cardiovascular health, but elite cyclists and elite swimmers are known to have worse bones than their counterparts. So it's not great for your bones. You know, and I think I'm so glad Dr. Ganji is on the call here with us, because it wasn't until recently, and thinking about, I know we're kind of cutting on time, but bringing it back to where soft tissues come in, I totally have been so fixated on the importance of bone health that there's this whole other side of the coin. And that's if you exercise too much when you're young, not only can you have fatigue problems in terms of bone, but that tendon bone interface is so fragile and important. And so the tendon disruption, you know, issues that come at the enthesis level are also really important. And so she's, you know, really shown some nice work on this. And it's a really tricky balancing act. So kind of to the point of like, which exercise should you do? Well, baseball pitchers don't retire from bone fractures. They retire from rotator cuff tears, right? And so it's really how these tissues interface that, you know, is really important to study. I see a question. I'd love to get to it before we run out of time. Mradan, I'm sorry.
Mradan, yeah, go ahead.
Hi, thank you so much for that talk, Dr. Kersh. It was really fantastic. So in most of your experiments, it seems like you've examined what would happen if you increase loading and in those sort of environments, right, with sports and exercise. What if we look at environments where there's decrease of loading, say for astronauts, who are, you know, you constantly see these videos of astronauts tied to treadmills and things like that, trying to maintain bone density. So my question really is the decrease in cortical and trabecular bones similar to the way that it increases under increased loads? And
No.
how would, you know, they have to adapt their exercise regimen to get back to like the on-earth loading state?
Great question. So I was just at ASBMR, American Society of Bone Mineral Research, and they had a whole talk on spaceflight. And I don't remember the number, but astronauts lose bone like a couple % a month, I think, in terms of mineral density. So, and it's much faster. It's much, much easier to lose bone than it is to gain bone. And so as soon as you stop loading, why that is from a, why does bone need to work that way? It's some sort of efficiency process, right? It is only going to be where it needs to be. And that's what's remarkable about it. And so if you decrease the loading, that bone will resorb quickly. The same happens with people who get orthopedic implants. The implant itself takes most of the force. And so there's this phenomena of stress shielding. And so the bone underneath the implant actually doesn't see as much strains because the implant's so strong relative to the bone. And so then the bone starts to resorb and then the implant loosens. And the orthopedic companies are like dying to figure out how to do this. That's why they have different textures on their implants and so on. So the drop in bone is so much faster, and that's what makes it so challenging. Because if you kind of start going down that way and you want to try and gain, it's challenging. To my knowledge, there has not been an exercise study that has ever actually gotten people back to baseline. Every exercise study that's been done in adults decreases the amount of bone loss, but it's still losing bone. Does that make sense? So the rate is not as bad, but they haven't been able to actually get back on the curve. So it's a real challenge. NASA's funding this stuff. I just can't figure out how to, they're doing it all in rats, and for them, some of the questions are really, then it becomes a pharmaceutical possible solution, right? Where you give people a bisphosphonate or something beforehand, but they were saying in this talk that NASA's really conservative. And so they really want to find ways to either prime these astronauts. So you might need to be on the astronaut track when you're 8 so that you're ready to go and not lose so much bone. Who knows? Kind of what is it, Ender's Game? Where they track you, you're going to be on this. Anyway, totally random.
Well,
Thank you
Gattaca,
so
right?
much.
Do you remember that movie with Jude,
I read the
Jude
book.
Law?
Oh, Gattaca.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I don't think we want to go down that route. No, that's bad.
I mean, overall, we don't, I guess.
There was, I don't see any more raised hands, but obviously we could have this conversation much longer. But I suggest we end the recording here. And thank you so much again, Mariana. This was phenomenal. A lot of fun.
Thank you.
We appreciate you being here.
So everyone is on the call. It will continue next week with Tal Cohen. So definitely join us again, please.